My husband hid his mistress from me for 7 years. She wrote to me, "Your husband and I have a child together. He's hiding it from you." I silently made one call and waited when he came home. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me when I first knew, and every time I give the same answer. I didn't. Not really. Not in the way you know that the sky is blue or that winter follows fall. I knew the way you know something is wrong with a house before you find the crack in the foundation. A feeling that lives in your chest, quiet and persistent, that you learn to explain away because the alternative is too enormous to face. My name is Claire Whitfield, and for 11 years I was married to Daniel Whitfield. We lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a house we'd bought together the year after our wedding. A colonial with a red door. A yard I spent every spring replanting. 2 dogs, Biscuit and May. A daughter, Sophie, who was 9 years old and had her father's eyes, and as I would later be grateful for, absolutely nothing else of his. Before everything fell apart, my life looked, from the outside, like something worth envying. Daniel was a senior project manager at a commercial real estate firm. I worked part-time as a medical billing specialist, 3 days a week from home, which gave me mornings with Sophie and afternoons to myself. We took vacations to the Outer Banks every summer. We had a good circle of friends. We went to church on Easter and Thanksgiving. We were, by every visible measure, fine. I want to be honest about this. I was not an unhappy woman. I was not pining for something more. I loved my life. I loved my daughter. I even loved Daniel, or the man I believed Daniel to be. The first sign came 18 months before the message. I had noticed it, filed it away, and chosen, deliberately, not to pull it back out. It was a Thursday evening in February. Daniel came home an hour and a half late from work, which wasn't unusual in itself. His job ran long sometimes, deals closing, clients demanding. But that night, when he walked through the door, he was freshly showered. I could smell it. His hair was damp at the temples, and he was wearing a clean shirt, not the one he'd left in that morning. I knew because I had ironed that shirt myself, a pale blue Oxford, and the one he came home in was a gray button-down I rarely saw him wear. I said nothing. I told myself he'd gone to the gym. I told myself I was being paranoid, insecure, the kind of wife I'd always promised myself I would never become. I cooked dinner. We ate together. Sophie told us about a project she was doing on the water cycle, and Daniel helped her draw a diagram after dessert, and I watched them at the kitchen table and thought, I am imagining things. Look at this. Look at what we have. But there were other signs, and looking back now, I can see them all lined up like stones across a river, each one asking me to step forward. He started sleeping with his phone face down. He began locking his car manually instead of using the key fob, which I only noticed because the beep that usually told me he was home stopped. He traveled more for work, or said he did. Denver in March. Atlanta, twice in April. Charlotte so many times it stopped sounding like a city and became just a word he used. He was present at dinner, but elsewhere in his mind. And when I touched his hand across the table, sometimes he flinched, just slightly. The way a person does when they're pulled out of a thought they weren't ready to leave. I started noticing things I couldn't explain away. A receipt in his jacket pocket for a restaurant in Durham, a nice one, the kind with cloth napkins and a wine list, dated on a Wednesday he'd claimed to be in a conference call until 7. a slight hesitation before he answered simple questions, as if he needed a half-second to decide which version of the truth to give me. The way he sometimes looked at Sophie with an expression that troubled me. Not coldness, but something more complicated. Guilt, maybe. Something private that he was carrying and hadn't decided to put down. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was reading too much into things. I told myself that 11 years of marriage came with mysteries, with private interior lives, with habits that didn't require explanation. I told myself all of this with great determination and went on making lunches and paying invoices and walking Biscuit and May in the evenings. And I kept the feeling pressed down beneath everything else, small and dense and silent. And then, on a Tuesday morning in September, while Sophie was at school and Daniel was at work and I was sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee going cold beside my keyboard, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hi, I know this will be hard to read. My name is Renee. I've been with your husband for 7 years. We have a son together. His name is Mason. He's 5 years old. Daniel has been hiding him from you. I think you deserve to know." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone down on my desk, very carefully, as if it were made of something fragile. I looked out my window at the backyard, at the flower beds I had replanted in April, at the red door of my own house. And then I picked up a different phone, my landline, the one I used for work, and I made one single call. And after that, I sat back down in my chair, and I waited. After I made that call, I sat very still for a long time. The coffee beside my keyboard had gone completely cold. Biscuit had come to sit at my feet, the way dogs do when they sense something has shifted in the air, and I could feel the warmth of him against my ankle, and I focused on that one small physical fact, because everything else in the room had begun to feel uncertain. The walls, the furniture, the framed photo on my desk of Daniel and me at Sophie's kindergarten graduation, both of us laughing, his arm around my shoulders, his face turned toward mine. I had called my sister Karen. That was the one call I made. Karen lived 40 minutes away in Cary and worked as a paralegal, and she was the only person in my life I trusted completely. When she answered, I didn't explain. I just said, "Karen, I need you to come over. Right now. Don't ask me anything until you're here." And she said, without hesitation, "I'm leaving now." While I waited, I did what I imagine most people do when the ground disappears beneath them. I tried to calculate the damage. 7 years. The message had said 7 years. Sophie was 9. That meant this had been happening since before Sophie started first grade. Since before the trip we'd taken to Costa Rica for our 8th anniversary, the one Daniel had planned as a surprise, the one I still thought of as one of the best weeks of my life. Since before his mother's funeral, when he had held me in the parking lot of the church and cried, and I had believed, without question, that I knew exactly who this man was. A son, 5 years old. His name was Mason. I thought about that child, and something happened inside me that I hadn't expected. Not anger, not at the boy, but a kind of grief that surprised me with its weight. That child had nothing to do with any of this. He was 5 years old. He had his father's last name. Maybe, or maybe not. He had a mother who had just sent a stranger a message on a Tuesday morning. And he had a father who had looked at him and looked at me, and apparently found a way to keep both lives running in parallel, like 2 trains on separate tracks that he somehow managed to board and exit without either one ever knowing the other existed. How? That was the question that came first. Not why. Not yet. But how? How do you sustain that for 7 years? How do you sit across from your wife at dinner, night after night, and look at her and say the ordinary things and laugh at the ordinary things, and then drive to another house where another person is waiting and be a different version of yourself? What kind of discipline does that require? What kind of coldness? Or maybe it wasn't coldness. Maybe it was compartmentalization so complete it had become a kind of madness. I didn't know yet. I only knew that I had been living inside a fiction, and the man who had written it had never intended to tell me. Karen arrived in 38 minutes. I heard her car in the driveway and felt something in my shoulders release, just slightly. She came through the back door the way she always did, and she took one look at my face and sat down across from me without saying anything. I handed her my phone. I watched her read the message. I watched her face change. "Okay," she said after a long silence. Her voice was very steady. "Tell me everything." I told her everything I knew, which wasn't much yet. The message, the signs I'd dismissed, the receipts, the late nights, the phone turned face down on the nightstand. When I finished, Karen was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing that I most needed someone to say. "Claire, this is not your fault, and you are not going to fall apart. You're going to be smart about this." She was right. I knew she was right. And something in me, something that the shock had temporarily buried, began to surface. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and more useful. I was not going to react. I was not going to confront Daniel that night with nothing in my hands but a text message from a woman I'd never heard of. I had read enough, in life if not in books, to know that a man capable of maintaining a 7-year deception was also capable of lying his way through a confrontation. He would deny it. He would make me feel unstable. He would call Renee a troubled woman, a liar, someone with a fixation. And without evidence, I would have nothing to hold against him. So I needed evidence. Karen, who had handled enough family law cases to know the shape of these situations, walked me through the basics. Before I did anything else, before I made a single move that Daniel could see, I needed to understand what we had, financially, legally, in every practical sense. That night, after Sophie was in bed and Daniel had come home and eaten the dinner I served him and kissed me on the cheek the way he always did, I sat in the bathroom with my phone and opened every shared account I could access. I took photographs of the balances. I noted the account numbers. I looked at credit card statements going back 12 months, and I found things. Restaurant charges, hotel bookings in Durham, a recurring monthly transfer of $400 to an account I didn't recognize, $400 a month, every month, for as far back as the statements went. I closed the apps, turned off the light, and lay down beside my husband in the dark. He was already asleep. I listened to him breathe, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, "You have no idea what I'm capable of." The plan was beginning to form, slowly, precisely, and without any room for error. The following Monday morning, I dropped Sophie at school, came home, and called a divorce attorney. I had spent the weekend researching, not visibly. I used my work laptop, cleared the history each time, searched during the hours Daniel was home and in another room so that if he glanced at my screen, it would show a medical billing spreadsheet. I found 4 attorneys in Raleigh with strong reputations in contested divorce and asset division. I called the first one whose reviews mentioned the word thorough. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and her office was downtown, on the 6th floor of a building with a lobby that smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. I wore my work clothes, a blazer, dark slacks, because I had learned early in life that the way you dress in a professional setting tells people how seriously to take you. Patricia was in her mid-50s, composed and direct, with the manner of someone who had sat across from a great many people in a great deal of pain and had learned to hold steady while they found their footing. I told her everything. The message from Renee, the 7 years, the child, the $400 monthly transfer, the hotel receipts I'd photographed from the credit card statements. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked a series of precise questions about our assets, the house, the retirement accounts, Daniel's salary, my income, the length of the marriage. She explained what North Carolina's equitable distribution laws meant in practice. She told me what I needed to document, what I should not do, including not moving money, not changing passwords, not tipping Daniel off in any way, and what my realistic options were. Before we talk strategy, she said, leaning forward slightly, I want you to be clear on one thing. You will likely need more than a text message from this woman to establish paternity and connect it to marital assets. Do you have any way to verify her claim independently? I told her I had Renee's phone number. Then, Patricia said, you need to meet her. I had already been thinking the same thing. I didn't call Renee. I texted her from my personal phone the following morning. I kept the message brief. I believe you. I'm not angry at you. I need to talk in person. Are you willing? Her response came within 20 minutes. Yes, I've been waiting for you to reach out. We met 3 days later at a coffee shop in Durham. Neutral ground, her suggestion, which told me something about her. She was younger than I'd expected, early 30s with tired eyes and a careful way of speaking that made me think she had rehearsed this conversation many times and was still nervous. She brought documents. That surprised me. Bank records showing Daniel's deposits into an account in her name, text messages between them, years of them, that she had printed and organized by date. A photo of Mason, 5 years old, dark-haired, with Daniel's jaw and Daniel's particular way of holding his shoulders. I looked at that photo for a long time. Why now? I asked her. Why tell me now, after 5 years? She looked at her coffee cup. Because he told me last month that he was never going to leave you. He said he'd made his decision, and then he told me... She paused, and something moved across her face. That if I ever told you, he would deny Mason was his. He said he'd make me look unstable. He'd already talked to a lawyer, he said, about what his options were if I caused problems. So Daniel had been to a lawyer already. He had been planning, not to come clean, but to protect himself, from Renee, from his own son. I felt something shift in my chest, and it wasn't grief anymore. It was something harder and much more steady. Back in Raleigh, things were beginning to move in ways I couldn't fully see yet. Daniel, I would learn later, had noticed small things. The way I'd been slightly quieter over the past 2 weeks. The fact that I'd taken a half day from work, something I rarely did, on the day I'd met with Patricia. He mentioned it casually one evening. You seem distracted lately. Everything okay? And I smiled and said I was tired, and he nodded, and I watched him watch me, and I knew that some part of him was recalibrating. He texted Renee that same evening. She showed me later. The message said, "Have you talked to anyone? Be honest with me." She didn't answer him that night, but I had already walked out of that coffee shop in Durham with copies of everything she'd brought. Texts, bank records, the photograph. I had driven home and scanned everything and sent it to Patricia's secure client portal. I had the point of no return behind me now, and I had crossed it deliberately with both eyes open. That night, Daniel came to bed and kissed me on the temple and said, "I love you, Claire." And I said, "I love you too." And I lay in the dark and listened to him fall asleep and thought about Patricia's office and the documents in her portal and the steady, irreversible momentum of what I had put in motion, There was no going back, and I didn't want to. Patricia filed the divorce petition on a Friday afternoon. I had asked her to time it for end of day, when Daniel would be in a client meeting. I knew his schedule well enough to know he'd be unreachable until 6. By the time the paperwork was processed and the notification went out, it was nearly 5 o'clock. I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot waiting for Sophie. When she climbed into the back seat, she was talking about a book report, and I turned the radio on low and I drove us home and made spaghetti and listened to her read aloud after dinner. And I held the evening together with both hands like something I was afraid to spill. Daniel found out that night. He came home at 7:15, which was later than usual. I heard his car in the drive, and then a long silence, longer than it should have been, before the front door opened. He came into the kitchen where I was cleaning up, and the look on his face told me he knew. Someone at the firm had called him, or he'd checked something on his phone. The specific path didn't matter. He knew. Claire. His voice was very quiet. "Sophie's in her room," I said without turning from the sink. "Keep your voice down." What followed was not the explosion I had prepared for. Daniel was not, at his core, a man who shouted. What he did instead was scarier. He went very still, and his voice dropped lower, and he said things with a precision that made them feel like they had been planned. He said I was acting without thinking. He said I had no idea what I was doing. He said that if I pushed this, I would regret it, because he knew things about our finances that I didn't, and he had already spoken to an attorney, his attorney, and I should be very careful about the position I was putting myself in. That last part. He'd already spoken to an attorney. He said it the way men say things when they want you to feel like you've walked into a room they prepared for you. I had been expecting that. Patricia had told me to expect it. I turned from the sink and looked at him directly. "I know about Mason," I said. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted. Then he said, "That is not what you think it is." I didn't answer. I dried my hands on a dish towel, walked out of the kitchen, went upstairs to check on Sophie. I heard him standing in the kitchen below me, not moving for a long time. The escalation came from an unexpected direction. 2 days later, Daniel's mother, Sylvia Whitfield, called me. Sylvia was 71 years old, sharp, and entirely devoted to her son. She had never fully warmed to me in 11 years, though she'd been cordial enough that I'd convinced myself it was just her manner. The call lasted 11 minutes. She told me I was making a catastrophic mistake. She told me that Daniel had explained the situation to her. She didn't use the word Renee or the word Mason, and that whatever I thought I knew was not the full picture. She told me that if I continued with this, I would lose the house, lose my standard of living, and that Daniel would fight for primary custody of Sophie because of my instability. Instability. The word he'd chosen to feed his mother, the same word he'd threatened to use against Renee. She was also, I noticed, careful not to say anything that could be interpreted as a legal threat. Careful in the way someone is when they've been advised by a lawyer to be careful. I told Sylvia, very calmly, that I appreciated her concern, that this was a private matter between Daniel and me, and that I would be handling it through my attorney. Then I ended the call, sat down, and texted Patricia a full summary of what had been said. The following day, Renee called me, nearly in tears. Daniel had contacted her, apparently through a mutual acquaintance, since she had blocked his number, and told her that if she cooperated with me in any way, he would pursue full legal action to contest paternity, which would require DNA testing that could take months and would put Mason through an ordeal. He told her she had made a terrible mistake trusting me, that I was using her, and that the wisest thing she could do was retract everything and go quiet. I told Renee to save every message, every contact, every record of that conversation. I told her Patricia could help protect her, separately, and that what Daniel was doing, attempting to intimidate a witness, was not something he could do without consequences. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, I trust you." And I realized that this woman, a woman I had every reason to despise, had become, in some strange and necessary way, an ally. Daniel and Sylvia had threatened me. They had threatened Renee, and they had retreated for the moment behind lawyers and silence. I took 3 days. I drove Sophie to my mother's house in Greensboro, told her I needed a few days to handle some things, and came home to an empty house. I slept. I walked the dogs. I sat in the backyard in the mornings with coffee, and I let myself feel, fully, the grief of what was ending. Not for Daniel, but for the life I had believed in. The red door, the Outer Banks, the version of myself who had ironed that pale blue Oxford shirt and trusted the man who wore it. I let myself grieve it, and then I let it go. On the 4th day, Daniel came to the house. I had known he would. He still had his key. We hadn't reached that stage yet. And he let himself in on a Sunday afternoon while I was in the backyard reading. I heard the back door open and looked up, and there he was. He was dressed carefully, in clothes I recognized. A sweater I'd given him for Christmas 2 years ago, dark jeans, and he was holding a white paper bag from the bakery on Elm Street, the one we used to walk to on Sunday mornings with Sophie and the dogs. He was, I understood immediately, staging a scene, a familiar one. "I thought we could talk," he said. He set the bag on the patio table. "I brought those almond croissants you like." I put my book down. I looked at him. I felt nothing that he was expecting me to feel. He sat down across from me without being invited to, and began to speak in a voice that was low and careful and full of a sorrow that I could not determine was real. He said he had made terrible choices. He said he had been weak. He said he had never stopped loving me, not for a single day, and that the situation with Renee had never been what I was imagining. It had started as something meaningless, he said. And then Mason had happened, and he had panicked, and the lie had grown until he couldn't find a way out of it. It was a good performance. I will say that. The sweater, the croissants, the careful voice, the confession framed as helplessness rather than cruelty. He knew me well enough to know what might reach me, and he used that knowledge with a precision I had once mistaken for intimacy. "I want to try to fix this," he said. "If you drop the petition, we could go to counseling. I'll come clean about everything. Mason, the finances, all of it. We could do this differently, Claire. We don't have to blow up everything." I picked up my coffee cup. I took a sip. The morning was cool, and the dogs were lying in the sun near the flower beds, and everything was very quiet. "No," I said. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before on his face. Not anger, not sadness, but something closer to disorientation, as if I had responded in a language he hadn't prepared for. "Just like that," he said. "Just like that," I said. He tried twice more, in slightly different framings, once more as grief, once as reasonableness, the practical husband voice that had always been his most effective register with me. Each time I waited for him to finish and said nothing, or said no, or said, "I think you should leave now, Daniel." He finally stood up, took the bakery bag with him. I noticed that. It struck me as revealing, and walked back through the house. I heard the front door close. I sat with the quiet for a long time. Then I took out my phone and texted Patricia. "He came here, wanted me to drop the petition. I declined. He left. She responded within the hour, Good. Document the visit. Time. What was said. What he brought. Everything. And then I reached out to the people I had been putting off reaching out to. I had kept this almost entirely private. Karen knew, Patricia knew, and Renee knew in her own separate way. But I had told almost no one in the life Daniel and I had built together. I had been afraid, I think, of becoming an object of pity or of sympathy that felt like pity's polite cousin. I had been afraid of what it would do to the carefully maintained surface of my life to let people see the crack that ran through it. But there is a cost to carrying things alone, and I had been paying it for weeks. I called my friend Diane, who had been my closest friend for 9 years, and who I had been keeping at arm's length since September. I told her everything. She arrived at my house within the hour with wine and groceries and the particular kind of righteous fury that only a true friend can offer, the kind that makes you feel not pitied, but defended. Over the following days, I let a few more people in, carefully, only those whose discretion I trusted. My colleague Janet, who had gone through her own divorce 6 years earlier and who told me, over coffee, every practical thing she wished someone had told her. My neighbor Ruth, 63 years old, who had lived alone for 20 years, and who said, with the directness of someone with no remaining patience for anything else, the moment you stop being afraid is the moment you've already won. And something happened in me during those days. Not a hardening. I had already done whatever hardening was necessary. Something else. A settling, the way a building settles into its foundation after the initial stress. I was not performing strength. I was simply in it, in the process, in the work of rebuilding, one careful brick at a time. Daniel, I knew, was watching. He was somewhere in this city staying with a friend from work, and he was watching and waiting to see if I would waver. His mother was watching. Perhaps Renee was watching too, in her own way from her own particular distance. Let them watch. I had stopped performing. 3 weeks into the formal proceedings, they came together. I hadn't expected that. I had expected them to continue operating separately. Daniel through his attorney, Sylvia through her pointed phone calls, perhaps Renee being pressured from whatever angle Daniel could still reach her. I had not expected them to arrive at my front door on a Saturday morning, side by side, Sylvia with a casserole dish covered in foil and Daniel with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who has been coached. I saw them through the living room window before I opened the door. I had a second to make a decision. I opened the door. "We'd like to talk," Sylvia said. She was dressed as if for church. The casserole was a specific touch. I recognized it as a power move dressed as domesticity, food as an argument for normalcy. We are people who bring casseroles. We are not a threat. I let them in because refusing to let them in would have required an energy I preferred to spend on other things, and because I wanted to hear what they had come to say. I made no offer of coffee. I sat in the armchair. They sat on the sofa. Daniel set the casserole on the coffee table, and Sylvia folded her hands in her lap and began. She spoke for perhaps 7 minutes without stopping. It was a composed speech, and I could hear, behind it, the structure of something that had been discussed and planned. She talked about Sophie first, always Sophie first, because that was the most effective lever, and she knew it. She said this was going to damage Sophie. She said the instability of a contested divorce would harm her development, her sense of security, her relationship with her father. She said that children needed intact families. She cited, without attribution, things she'd apparently read about the effects of divorce on children. Then she shifted. Her voice became almost warm. She said she wanted to be honest with me. woman to woman, and that what she was about to say came from love. She said she had always admired my strength, my dedication to my family. She said Daniel had made mistakes, and she was not excusing them, but that a marriage was larger than any single mistake, and that walking away was the easy choice, and that she had hoped, knowing me as she did, that I would be capable of making the harder one. It was masterfully done. The appeal to my ego, your strength, your dedication, the reframe of divorce as weakness, the window left open, not excusing him, but the whole structure of it designed to make me feel that staying was not capitulation, but valor. I waited until she finished. Then Daniel spoke. He looked at the floor while he spoke, which I recognized as a calculated display of remorse. He said he wanted to be the father Sophie deserved. He said he had already started looking into therapy. He said he had been in contact with a family mediator. Here he glanced up briefly, and that if I was willing, we could resolve everything quietly, without a court, without the kind of public exposure that would ultimately hurt all of us, but especially Sophie. Quietly, without a court, without exposure. There it was. That was the actual request. Not reconciliation, not healing, not Sophie's well-being. The request was for silence, for the whole machinery I had set in motion to stop before it reached the places he didn't want it to reach. The financial records, the asset disclosure, the formal establishment of Mason's paternity and its implications for child support and marital property. He wanted me to stop, dressed in a casserole and a coached expression of grief. I looked at both of them for a moment. Then I said, "I hear what you're saying. I want you to hear what I'm saying. This will proceed. Sophie will be protected through this process, by me with the help of my attorney. She will not be used as a reason for me to accept something that is wrong, and I would like you to leave my house now." Sylvia's composure lasted approximately 3 more seconds. Then it cracked. She told me I was being vindictive. She told me I was punishing Daniel out of pride. She said I was going to turn Sophie against her father, that she would make sure the court knew about my pattern of alienation. A phrase that landed with legal precision, another coach term. Her voice had risen. Daniel reached out and touched her arm, and she shook him off. I stood up. I walked to the front door and opened it. They left. Sylvia first, not looking at me. Daniel last. He paused on the threshold for a moment, and I saw something in his face that was not grief or performance, something stripped down, something close to the truth of what he was. I closed the door. I leaned my back against it and stood in my own hallway for a moment, and I will be honest, there was fear, real fear. The word alienation had been a deliberate shot, and I knew it had found a mark, because in custody situations, it was the kind of language that could be weaponized. I felt the fear move through me, and then I felt it transform, the way temperature transforms water into something else entirely. They were scared. That was what the visit meant. They were scared enough to come together, to rehearse, to bring a casserole and a coach speech. People who are winning don't do that. I pushed off the door and went to call Patricia. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in November, 8 weeks after I had filed. Patricia had been thorough. She had subpoenaed Daniel's financial records, both personal and business, and what had come back was more extensive than even I had prepared myself for. The $400 monthly transfer to Renee's account was only the surface. Beneath it, a separate credit card in Daniel's name alone, used consistently and exclusively at restaurants, hotels, and a furniture store in Durham over the course of 6 years. Charges at a pediatrician's office. A charge, 18 months earlier at a preschool in Durham. He had been paying for Mason's schooling with money that was, under North Carolina law, marital property. Patricia had also, with Renee's cooperation, obtained a voluntary DNA test confirming Daniel's paternity. Renee had agreed to it readily. She had never needed it to know what she knew, but she had understood, with a clarity that I had come to respect, that the paperwork mattered. I walked into the deposition room at 9 in the morning. Patricia was beside me. Daniel was across the table with his attorney, a man named Richard Coles who had a reputation for being aggressive in asset negotiations. Sylvia was not present. Depositions are not family gatherings, but I could feel, in Daniel's posture, that he had spoken to her that morning. He looked, I thought, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that comes from maintaining a position that is no longer defensible. Patricia began with the financial records. She walked through them methodically, item by item, and at each step she asked Daniel to explain. He answered carefully through Coles, but the answers had to account for the reality of what the documents showed, and reality had a way of not cooperating with careful answers. The furniture store receipts, the pediatrician charges, the preschool payments. Then she moved to the text messages. Renee had provided 4 years of communications between herself and Daniel, organized by date. Patricia read selected messages into the record, not all of them, but enough, chosen with precision. Messages in which Daniel discussed his plans for Mason's future. Messages in which he referenced, more than once, his intention to keep things separate. One message from 3 years earlier in which he had written, "Mason can't know about my other life until I figure out how to handle this. I need you to be patient. My other life." I watched Daniel's face as that sentence was read aloud. He kept his expression very still, but something moved behind his eyes. A rapid internal adjustment, the way a person recalibrates when they realize the room they're standing in is not the one they thought it was. Coles objected to the framing of 2 of the questions. Patricia noted the objections and continued. That was when Daniel, I think under the accumulation of it, the specific weight of hearing his own words spoken in a room with a court reporter, made the mistake. He interrupted, not loudly, not dramatically. He leaned forward slightly and said, in a voice that was trying to be controlled but wasn't quite, "You're presenting this completely out of context. You're making it sound like I was trying to deceive Claire, and that's a distortion of what actually happened." Patricia paused. She looked at him over her reading glasses. She said very calmly, "Mr. Whitfield, I'm going to ask you to respond only when your counsel advises you to. But since you've opened this, I'll ask, what is the correct context for a 7-year secret and a child your wife was unaware of?" Coles said, "My client won't be answering that." But Daniel had already opened his mouth again. He said, The situation with Renee was something that she understood what it was. She knew from the beginning that He stopped. He looked at Coles. Coles put a hand on his arm, but the room had heard it. The court reporter's fingers had moved. She knew from the beginning. He had just characterized his own mistress as complicit in a deception, in a room where her cooperation and her documents were the foundation of the case against him. Patricia gathered her papers with the unhurried movement of someone who has just received exactly what she came for. She said, "I think we have what we need for today." In the hallway afterward, waiting for the elevator, Patricia stood beside me and said nothing for a moment. Then, "He cracked." That was the crack. Her voice was even, professional, but I saw, just briefly, the corner of her mouth. I stood in that hallway in my dark blazer with the document folder under my arm, and I felt something I had not felt since September. Not triumph. It was too early for triumph, and I had learned over these weeks not to mistake momentum for arrival, but something clean, something that was the opposite of the feeling I'd had sitting at my desk with the cold coffee and the stranger's message on my phone. I had been afraid they would be too powerful. I had been afraid of Sylvia's language, of Daniel's lawyer, of the machinery they could bring against me, and they had brought it, and it had not been enough. Because I had told the truth, and they had not. The divorce was finalized 7 months after I filed. Those 7 months were not easy. I want to be accurate about that, because the story of what happened is not the story of a clean or painless victory. It is the story of a victory that cost something, and that is worth saying. There were weeks of difficult financial negotiations. Coles pushed hard on asset valuation, on the mortgage, on my part-time income versus Daniel's salary. Patricia pushed back harder with documentation, the credit card records, the paternity confirmation, the deposition transcript with Daniel's unadvised statement preserved in full. Every time Coles attempted to shift the terrain, Patricia had a document to re-anchor it. The custody arrangement was the part that required the most from me. Daniel's side had threatened the alienation claim, and though it had no substance, Patricia confirmed this. The process of establishing that Sophie's best interests were genuinely centered in our plan was emotionally exhausting. I submitted character references. I provided Sophie's school records, her medical history, documentation of every appointment, every parent-teacher conference, every camp and activity I had managed for 9 years. I let the records speak. The final agreement gave me primary physical custody of Sophie, with Daniel having alternating weekends and 1 evening per week. It gave me the house. I could keep it if I refinanced within 6 months, which I was able to do. The retirement accounts were split according to the equitable distribution formula, which, given the length of the marriage and the disparity in our incomes, came out in my favor. The credit card debt Daniel had accumulated across those 6 years was apportioned to him. The monthly transfer to Renee, established as a support payment for Mason, was formalized and increased under a separate legal proceeding in which Renee was represented by her own attorney, which Patricia had helped arrange. Daniel was now legally required to pay child support for both Sophie and Mason, calculated from his actual income. He could no longer keep those two worlds separate because the law had made them continuous. The day the divorce was finalized, I did not celebrate. I had Sophie that evening, and we ordered pizza and watched a movie she had been asking to see for weeks, and at some point she fell asleep against my shoulder on the couch, and I sat there in the quiet of my living room in the house with the red door, and I breathed. Sylvia Whitfield called me once, after the finalization. She said nothing for a moment after I answered, and then she said very quietly, "I hope you know what you've done to this family." I told her I was sorry for her pain and that I hoped things would be easier for her in time, and I ended the call. I didn't hear from her again. Daniel moved into an apartment in Durham. He came for Sophie on his scheduled days, and the handoffs were brief and civil, the way they need to be when a child is watching. Sophie was in therapy with a woman who came well recommended and who, over the following months, helped her find language for things she'd been carrying without knowing she was carrying them. Renee had moved into a larger apartment with Mason. She and I were not friends. It would be too much to call us that. But we were something that I don't have a precise word for. We were women who had been used by the same person in different ways, and who had, against every expectation, chosen to face that with honesty rather than against each other. She texted me once, a few weeks after everything was settled, to say thank you. I texted back, "Take care of that boy." She responded, "I will." Richard Coles had pushed and threatened and filed objections and deployed every tactic available to him. And in the end, the documents had been stronger. The truth had been stronger. The 7 years of evidence that Daniel had never imagined would be gathered and organized and presented in a room with a court reporter. That had been stronger. I had walked into this with nothing but a text message from a stranger. I had walked out with my daughter, my house, a fair division of what I had helped build, and a clarity about myself that I had never had before. I had learned what I was capable of when I stopped being afraid of the answer. Daniel had walked in with a lawyer, a mother, 6 years of careful financial concealment, and a plan to protect himself. He'd walked out with an apartment in Durham, 2 child support payments, and a deposition transcript he would spend a long time wishing didn't exist. There were no compromises that shouldn't have been made. I had not given ground out of fear or exhaustion or the desire for it to simply be over. I had stood in every room that was required of me. The attorney's office, the coffee shop in Durham, my own backyard, the deposition room. And I had told the truth, and I had held the line. That was the victory. Not dramatic, not loud, but complete. A year after the divorce was finalized, I took Sophie to the Outer Banks. It was the same stretch of coast we'd gone to every summer as a family, and I had wondered, when I planned it, whether it would feel like a ghost of something, whether I would spend the week haunted by the shape of what it used to be. I had given myself permission to feel that if it came, it didn't come. Sophie spent 3 days solid in the water, and in the evenings we walked the beach and collected shells and ate fried fish at a place we'd never tried before, a little restaurant that had been there longer than either of us had been alive. We watched the sunset from the balcony of the rental, and Sophie leaned her head against my arm and said, without any particular weight to it, the way children say important things, as if they're just describing the weather, "Mom, I think this is the best trip we've ever taken." And I squeezed her shoulder and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would have added to that. My life, in the year that followed the divorce, changed in ways I had not fully predicted. The refinancing of the house had required me to return to full-time work. I found a position as a billing supervisor for a regional medical group, a job I had not imagined wanting and discovered, unexpectedly, that I was very good at. The work was complex and required precision and persistence, and I found that those were qualities I had, after everything, in considerable supply. I got a promotion within 8 months. Diane and I started walking together 3 mornings a week, through the neighborhood and sometimes through the greenway, and those walks became the rhythm of something I was building. Not a replacement for what I'd lost, but something genuinely mine. Ruth brought soup over when I was sick in February and stayed to watch a documentary, and I realized that the community I had thought of as ours was, in fact, mine. It had always been mine. Sophie and I started taking a pottery class on Saturday mornings. Neither of us was particularly talented. We went anyway and came home with lopsided bowls that I lined up on the kitchen windowsill and refused to throw away. As for Daniel, the picture assembled itself from things I heard, from what Sophie occasionally mentioned, from what Karen told me when she felt I should know. The 2 child support payments, for Sophie and for Mason, along with the division of the retirement accounts, had restructured his finances significantly. The lifestyle that had funded restaurants in Durham and hotel rooms and furniture for a second household was no longer available to him. The arithmetic of his own choices had caught up with him. Renee had initially believed that with the paternity formalized and support payments established, some version of a future with Daniel remained possible. That belief did not survive contact with reality. He was inconsistent with Mason's scheduled time. He missed payments twice, requiring legal enforcement. Renee filed for sole custody after 11 months. When I heard that, I felt something close to sorrow, not satisfaction, for Mason, who was 6 years old and had done nothing to anyone. That child deserved a father who showed up. He was not going to get one, and that was not something I could fix. It sat in me quietly without bitterness. Sylvia had moved closer to Daniel to help fill the gaps. She had loved her son in a way that blinded her to what he was. That is a particular grief I would not wish on anyone. My life, in contrast, had become something I could not have imagined sitting at my desk in September with a stranger's message on my phone. It was quieter than before and more genuinely mine, chosen not because it was familiar, but because it was real. Sophie got the lead in the school play that spring. She was extraordinary, full of a confidence she had somehow grown in the middle of everything. When she took her bow, she found me in the third row and smiled, and I thought, there it is. That's what I was protecting. I went home that night to my house with the red door. Biscuit and May were waiting. The lopsided bowls were on the kitchen windowsill. I made tea and sat in my own kitchen in the quiet and felt, for the first time in a very long time, at home. Not in the house, in my life. The truth doesn't ask you to be fearless. It only asks you to be patient, to carry it carefully until the moment it can speak for itself. I spent years making space for things that didn't deserve it. The day I stopped was the day my life became mine again. If you recognize something in this story, that quiet feeling you've been taught to explain away, trust it. You are not imagining things. What would you have done in my place? There was no perfect path, only the choice to face it or not. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Subscribe if you haven't. There are more stories here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.